All right, well, given that it's 12:30, we will go ahead and get started since we have only a few minutes for this panel, 45 to be exact. So first and foremost, I want to thank everyone for joining the panel today. My name is Lauren Latchford, and I am the Policy and Impact Manager at Finless Foods, and I'm delighted to moderate our panel, Investing in Technologies to Supply Seafood for Our Future. All right. So just getting set up here. So we have a stellar panel here to speak to investments in these technologies. First, we have Bryce Phillips, Vice President of Sustainability at Phillips Foods. In addition, he is serving as in his 5th year elected as chairman of the Crab Council for the National Fisheries Institute, the largest seafood trade association in the U.S. Next, we have Dane Klinger, Director of Aquaculture at Nonprofit Conservation International, where he leads their global programs on aquaculture governance, management, and finance and innovation. Dane is also an affiliated scholar at the Center for Food Security and Environment at Stanford University. And he also serves on the Aquaculture Stewardship Council's Technical Advisory Group. We also have Shannon Cosentino-Rausch, Chief Strategy Officer at Finless Foods, a plant-based and cell-cultured alternative seafood company. In her role, Shannon oversees multiple departments and guides the vision, long-term planning, and strategic decision-making for the company. And to round out the panel, we have Larson Mettler, Managing Director of Oceans and Seafood Fund at S2G Ventures, who brings 2 decades of experience in the oceans and finance sectors. Larson is responsible for identifying opportunities, supporting entrepreneurs, and building the blue economy ecosystem. So before we go into our panel questions, I'd like to spend a minute talking about the state of seafood to set the stage for panel insights. Seafood is increasingly recognized for its key role in food security and nutrition, contributing to over 17% of animal protein globally. Per the most recent UN State of the World Fisheries and Aquaculture report, global consumption of seafood is more than double the consumption rate it was 50 years ago, and demand for seafood is projected to double again by 2050. Aquaculture has helped keep the pace, with demand to date supplying almost half of the world's fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. But given the ever-increasing demand for seafood, aquaculture, which is also seeing its own innovations and scale-up, alone cannot solve the problem for a lack of supply. In addition to increased demand for seafood, we are seeing climate change-driven challenges to ocean health that are affecting our wild fish stocks. That is why it's more important than ever to support and invest in new technologies in the seafood industry, from wild capture to aquaculture, and innovations such as cell-cultured seafood that can fill the ever-widening gap between demand and supply, especially in a changing climate. So to get our panel started, and Dane, why don't we start with you? In a few sentences, can you describe the state of the state regarding your seafood sector?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks for everyone for attending. Aquaculture has grown dramatically over the last several decades, and as Lauren mentioned, it produces now more than half of the world's seafood. It's also a hugely diverse sector. In 2021, more than 500 individual species were cultivated, but it's rapidly consolidating. So fewer than 25 species make up 75% of total production. Another unique facet of the aquaculture sector is that it's dominated by smallholder farmers. There's a large amount of corporate consolidation happening, but the sector itself is still dominated by smallholders. Another facet is that outside salmon, there's a trend of low adoption of technology relative to agriculture. And so there's been lots and lots of improvement over the last 20 years, but there's still substantial opportunities to improve the overall productivity and performance of aquaculture, and close the yield gaps between your average farmer and some of the best producing farmers out there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dane. Now, Shannon, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. And thank you for setting the stage. I'm going to go into a little bit of what cell-cultured seafood is, because I think it really rounds out the state of the state. So cell-cultured is basically the concept where you can take a sample of cells from a wild animal or from cattle, et cetera, and grow them out in a production facility that in a lot of ways looks kind of like a microbrewery. Think large still drums. The cells are in the drums. You're feeding the cells nutrients like you would feed our cells or feed, to grow the brewery process, whether it's amino acids, salt, sugars. These cells can proliferate and grow out. You can harvest the cells, grow them around scaffold, kind of thinking scaffold of a building, right? A 3D structure to give the cells shape. That can be turned into whatever the product form your goal is, whether that's steak, whether that's, in our case, bluefin tuna sashimi. And that's kind of what cellular agriculture is in like a 101 version. So what is the state of the state? This is a rapidly advancing and growing industry. There are more companies than ever in the US, but also globally. There's been tremendous amount of investment moving in this industry for a lot of reasons, which I'll get into later, around food security, climate resilient food systems, this widening gap between supply and demand for animal protein. And so there's just an incredible interest in the potential of this industry. A lot of the companies, particularly the ones founded in the United States, which are some of the first and earliest and most well-capitalized companies, have really moved from R&D to pilot scale. So basically saying, we figured out how we can produce these cells and produce prototypes. We're figuring out how to then do so at a broader scale, like how can we produce more quantity, and particularly going through the regulatory process. So these products are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, similar bodies globally. And actually, we've seen the first 2 approvals in the US in the last 12 months, which is really exciting, especially since those 2 approvals are 2 of the only 3 in the world. So the FDA is really leading the way on this. And I think for a lot of the reasons we mentioned, the global priority of this industry. And so it's a really exciting time to see the technology scale, but also the regulatory pathway scale, and soon seeing some of these products come to market in the United States.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. Bryce, I would love to hear from you and on the wild capture side.
Yeah, great. So I would say on the positive side, things are going really, really well. We had a nice boost of demand for our pasteurized blue swimming crab product during the beginning of the pandemic, when all the chicken, beef, and pork was off the shelf because everyone bought it all. We've got really great oversight of our fishery by our pre-competitive council, which I'll elaborate a bit more about later. And I hate to dwell on some negatives, but I have to mention some of the negatives. There seems to be increased regulatory hurdles that continue to impede our progress. And not just my wild capture fishery, but a lot of other fisheries, while not delivering the results that were promised. And I'm speaking specifically about the seafood import monitoring program, which was really designed to help stop the inflow of IUU fishery products into the country, but it really hasn't resulted in any refusals or any significant deterrence at all. And that's not because IUU has stopped, it's because the program is fundamentally flawed. And the fact that lawmakers keep attempting to expand it to all species by jamming it into new bills is kind of pure insanity to me, and really puts a strong administrative burden on the importers that's very, very costly. And it's just a tough burden to get past. And not just for my sector, I'm going to end on a positive note here, but for all sectors of seafood, I will say the current focus on verifying that human rights abuses are not happening globally in our supply chains is very welcome, albeit a little bit late.
Great. Thank you so much, Bryce. And Larson, love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think it's a great panel, having the diversification of aquaculture, wild and cultivated seafood. And that's something that we at S2G and other investors in the blue economy completely support. From an investment standpoint, we view the blue economy as really the largest impact opportunity and one of the most financially viable of our lifetime at this point. The economy, which includes seafood, is about 1.5 to 2.5 trillion today, and we expect that to double by 2030. And it's everyone's responsibility, from our view, to change the way that we've been treating the oceans and seafood. So, for centuries, it's really been a one-sided equation with human gain and unquantified and unaccounted for natural loss from utilization, extraction, waste disposal. But today we're seeing emerging technologies and global commitments across all countries on local and global scales that are really looking to right this equation. In aquaculture, we're seeing, as Dane referenced, everything from enabling technologies for more efficiency On the wild side, we're seeing more responses to climate and also, waste disposal and resource utilization, so byproduct utilization. And then we're seeing the emergence of cultivated technologies as well. So, we think that all of these are required to feed, not only the 3 billion people that we have today on the planet relying on this as their primary protein, but certainly into the future. Historically, a lot of the groundwork for these technologies has been built on philanthropic capital, but over the last several years, we've seen an emergence of early stage venture capital where we're playing right now. Today there's about 1.5 billion committed directly to the sector for venture, kind of, Series C through Series B. But we're not seeing a lot of capital on the back end from, outstanding investors outside the corporate side. So, we think that there's going to be a need for capital here from private equity, pension funds, things like that to continue this growth. And, hopefully the early stage investment will make it more palatable for them. I think that historically folks in the sector have shied away a little bit because it's a little bit harder to understand than some of the other industries that people have options to invest in. It's also been very cyclical and volatile. Pricing, isn't totally in control of one player here. It spans across the different sectors. And funds with, short-term exit periods, like 5 years, have a difficult time hitting their return hurdles when they have these exogenous exposures to not only the, the market, but, sourcing as well as climate and resource capture.
Great. Thank you, Larson. I'm looking forward to digging into that a little bit more as we go through our questions. So the next question is for Bryce. What are some of the most exciting innovations that you're working on, and what are they trying to solve for?
Great. So I have 3, so I'm going to speak really quickly. Number 1 is our pre-competitive working group for sustainability. It's called the NFI Crab Council. We're organized under the umbrella of our trade association. The website's committedtocrab.org if you want to check it out. It isn't a new organization, but it is innovative in the way it brings competitors to the table to work together. We are a self-funded pre-competitive working group. We all pay money based on import volume. We're about to hold our 4th annual summer working group next week in Baltimore. It's a 2-day event where all my competitors are going to come into my restaurant and we'll talk sustainability and really sort of set the tone for the activities for the next year of the council. My membership in this council represents about 80% of the imported volume into the US. So it's pretty strong support for it. So any decisions that we make in that group are basically industry mandates. Number 2, the Crab Council is currently in the middle of a pilot program in Indonesia right now that we're studying how we can rear crabs at a hatchery for later release. We're going to utilize microwire tagging and DNA fingerprinting to be able to track and measure the successes of different cohorts of crablets that are released into the natural environment at different different parts of their life cycle. And the whole idea is to kind of figure out this tech, from the economic side first, make sure that it's economically viable and to streamline it so we can kind of help give nature a helping hand with stock replenishment. Number 3, and this is the final one, is the adoption amongst the council of the length-based spawning potential ratio stock status measurement tool across Southeast Asia. We've always been a data poor fishery, so this new tool enables us a quick and inexpensive way to understand what's going on underwater.
Great. Thank you so much, Bryce. Those are really exciting innovations happening in your sector. Now, Larson, I'd love to turn to you to hear about any of the innovations that you are investing in.
Yeah, it's hard to pick favorites. It's like choosing between your children. So, we can cluster some of these up. We're seeing some emerging areas that are of particular interest and importance for us. So I would start that, one of the building blocks that we're investing is ocean intelligence, right? And this spans seafood and climate. As we all know, I believe that the ocean is the life support system of our planet. It produces over 70% of the oxygen we breathe. It sequesters 90% of the atmospheric greenhouse gases. And as we mentioned before, it's a primary source of protein for over 3 billion people. Kind of as Bryce mentioned, we need to study and understand how climate and the ocean is having an impact on all of the fisheries, both wild and aquaculture. So we're making a lot of investments in understanding that. Today it's kind of a common quote that we know more about our solar system than we do about our ocean. So that is an area where we certainly need to continue development. So we're investing a lot in satellites, buoys, submersibles, and these will play a role going forward throughout the entire supply chain. So some examples would be, from the drone technology side, we're doing ocean mapping, right? Only 10% of the ocean floor is currently mapped. That's bathymetric mapping. When you start looking at water columns and things like that, it's significantly less. So to have reliable resources going forward, we need to understand what's changing in the ocean. In Alaska, you saw 9 billion crab disappear last year. Is there a real explanation? People have theoretical ideas, but they're not quite sure. From an aquaculture standpoint, when we look at production, we think that you don't want to invest necessarily in an aquaculture site that's good today. You want to invest in one that's going to be good for 30 years from now, right? So that information is not out there today and needs to be thoroughly developed to continue to drive seafood production going forward. We're also heavily investing in enabling technologies, which is getting the most out of the resources that we have today. So as I mentioned, byproduct utilization, but it could be anything, throughout the production process. In aquaculture, we're looking a lot at feed technology, reducing those high COGS that are an issue for a lot of the farmers, shortening grow-out periods and reducing mortality rates as well. And then, a good portion of our portfolio is, as Shannon knows, is also in cultivated seafood. So, again, we see that as an area that is a necessary group to support going forward, with the growing population over the next 30 years. We don't believe that, a flat to declining wild fishery can support that. And aquaculture is starting to plane out as well. That's largely driven by a lot of government regulations where, we think that needs to change, specifically in the US. But you see, so a little bit of adverse work from governments, even in Norway with the new tax regime. So anything we can do to make people more efficient in their production.
Thank you, Larson. And since you touched on aquaculture a bunch, I'm going to kick it over to Dane to hear about any new innovations that he's working on.
I think similar to Larson, it's hard to pick a favorite. There's so many different different examples of innovation where the aquaculture sector is not only producing more seafood and realizing additional profitability, but also reducing the environmental footprint of production. But I think there are two key trends in innovation that are particularly exciting. One is in technology transfer from agriculture and human medicine. This can be everything from how you manage a farm to breeding and selective breeding programs for hatcheries to new ingredients for aquaculture feeds, and even away from the more scientific side to innovations in finance that are being transferred from agriculture. Things like different types of insurance and other financing mechanisms that historically have not been used in aquaculture, but have incentivized both increased production and improved environmental performance in agriculture. The other trend is around technology that enables smallholders to operate more efficiently. And so an example of this in the shrimp sector are companies that started out selling hardware, so auto feeders, larval counters, water quality sensors, but have expanded into pooling data across smallholder farmers, and then using that data to develop low-cost, real-time management advice that allows those small farmers to operate as if they were large farmers who had more resources to develop these products. And so I think as we look at aquaculture moving forward, in the past it's grown enormously, and now innovation is really being transferred into the aquaculture sector to help it continue to grow, but in the same footprint by being more efficient and optimizing production.
Thanks, Dane. Shannon, would you like to round us out on this question about what you're working on?
No, and this is great. We're in really great company for all the innovations going into ensuring that we have a thriving ocean and also production to meet the growing demand. So I guess to chime in here from the cellular agriculture space, like I mentioned a little bit, what we're doing, and Larson touched on it, but basically trying to innovate a new way of producing sustainable seafood. And so I think that our innovation is this new technology, There's a lot that goes into it, right? So there's the actual like R&D, trying to, in a lot of ways, do cutting edge science that's in the past been done on for cancer research, et cetera, and say, how can we apply some of these techniques? Similar to what you were just saying, Dane, how can we apply these techniques to food production? But on top of that, right, we're trying to create products. So there's a lot of work being done on product performance. How do we meet the taste and texture and appearance expectations that consumers will have? Most importantly, what you'll often hear in our industry and probably many of these evolving industries, how do we drop costs? What we're really saying is, how do we make sure that we can meet price expectations? And oftentimes for us, the benchmark is price parity with conventional commodity prices for these new technologies. And so what we need to do is figure out, how do we do it with the R&D at lower and lower costs so that we're able to achieve that. I would say for us, a really key part of that is scaling production. So often with economies of scale, right, it goes hand in hand. Us figuring out how to produce more also enables us to get it on more folks' plates, but it also helps us drop costs. And so there's a lot of work being done on scaling. I will say a big challenge on that front, which I'm sure we'll move into that space, is how do we build literal production capacity? So actually building production facilities. And it goes into Larson's points about what's the capital landscape going to look like for some of this innovation scale up beyond venture. So it's a really exciting time because the entire space is innovative. And I think we learn a lot from aquaculture, feed conversions, and from, wild capture. And we're all kind of taking what we can and applying it to this innovative space.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. Kicking that off in discussing finance a little bit more, what are the challenges that your sector is encountering when scaling technologies? And I'd love to hit on both the technical side and also the financial side. And Larson, I'd love for you to start with that.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think on the financial side, we touched on it a little bit earlier, about the state of the union here for where funding is. But there's different types of capital, and I think that there's different types that are suitable for different areas to address here. So as I mentioned earlier, there's the philanthropic capital, which I believe is necessary to get a lot of these ecosystems started. So if you think about something like macroalgae and kelp, those returns right now today, I believe, from an investor standpoint, are more suitable for philanthropic grant-making capital or some concessionary capital, because it's going to take a long time and long hold periods for that groundwork to be laid for it to be successful. From the venture standpoint, we are again investing in things to accelerate and improve the production and reliability and future of seafood production, but that certainly needs to grow, right? When you think about that, 1.5 billion, as I mentioned earlier, is not a lot of money to drive this industry. So we're really looking for a lot of corporates to get involved, and I think that that is not only just from a capital standpoint, but also from an adaptation standpoint. And when entrepreneurs are looking to drive this, it's really going to vary on where they can get financing. So if I look at something on the wild fishery side, things like bycatch reduction, ropeless gear, those have very limited market sizes or total addressable markets, and can only grow to be so big. So that takes a certain type of capital, and I think that both corporate and philanthropic or non-concessionary is appropriate for that. Dane mentioned some of the fintech platforms for smallhold farmers that are emerging and helping that supply chain shorten and become more efficient and reliable. That's a really high growth sector, right? You see a company like Fisheries just got valued at over $1 billion. That's something that when you look at venture, that makes a lot of sense for those capital dollars to come in there. When you move down the supply chain, or kind of further up in the capital stack to growth equity and buyout, again, that's more suitable for private equity firms and pension funds. We are seeing a lot of companies right now that are out there that are exploring with new technologies, but largely these are kind of longer term dividend plays right now. There's transitions in ownerships happening in an aging industry, specifically on the wild side. There's large CapEx commitments that are coming up that'll be billions of dollars per company to replace aging facilities, aging vessels, things like that. So it's heavy capital dollars, but you're not going to get a fintech play of a 30x return on your money. You're going to get a 15 to 20% IRR on an ongoing basis. But in terms of scaling the technologies as well, from the technical side for the entrepreneurs, a lot of it is trying to figure out, are you solving a problem for these companies and these producers, or is it, do you have an idea and you're just kind of trying to jam it in there? And while you're doing that, you need to think about how to scale it very quickly across multiple parties. So, I've seen examples of entrepreneurs going out, working with a company, whether it's a large aquaculture company or someone else, that will get very specific and detailed for that company alone to have it be adapted. And then when they move on to the next company, it's a bit of a rework, right? So I think there's, you've got to go out with version 1.0. You're not going to be 100% efficient for everybody out of the gate, but in order to get scale and more investment dollars, you need to have kind of a universal platform that can span multiple companies. And that's how you'll start getting traction, more dollars in the door.
Great. Thank you so much, Larson. I'd love to kick it over to Dane to hear a little bit about some of the challenges you're having when scaling in aquaculture.
Yeah. Excitingly, we've seen a lot of technology and innovation adoption in relatively consolidated and corporate sectors like the salmon aquaculture sector. But going back to aquaculture globally being dominated by small and medium-sized farmers, we've seen less technology adoption and less scaling of innovation amongst those farmers, which make up the majority of producers. And there are two main reasons. One is just a history of limited data collection. So when we go visit farmers around the world, they're often collecting water quality data manually, if at all. Production data is written down on paper, often in different formats, depending on who's collecting it. And that inhibits development of new tools and new innovations. But it also, if you're a farmer, a limited amount of data also inhibits you accessing finance to buy new technologies, to purchase new innovations, because you can't get financing for those innovations because investors really don't know how to understand your historical production and therefore your risk. And so limited data is a huge obstacle for small farmers. The other aspect is just small margins amongst small producers. So they're often not making a lot of money. They don't have a lot of production efficiencies because they're not using a lot of innovations. They're not using a lot of technology. And so there's little money to invest in innovation and capital improvements. But as I mentioned before, there are companies now coming into the aquaculture space who are developing ways to get around these problems and working with smallholders to, or really working across many smallholders to develop new tools and help them realize efficiencies and overall improvements in production.
Great. Thank you, Dane. Looking forward to seeing that scale and grow a little bit and get through those challenges. Shannon, I'd love to turn to you to hear a bit about challenges within the cell-cultured seafood sector.
Great. I also just want to call out that this has been such a learning for me because so many of the points that have been made are just so cross-applicable. So this has been great. I would say, just to kick off, there's no way to not talk about this. There's challenges doing cutting edge science, right? Like we're masterminding the areas of cell biology and tissue engineering and what does biomanufacturing look like, and just being able to do that. And like I mentioned, meet the product performance expectations around taste, texture, and then also price competitiveness. So definitely can't not miss that, not mention that bucket. But I'd also like to spend more time talking about scale because I think it really resonates with Larson and Dane's points about access to capital, but also capital that's fit for purpose for what you're trying to do. And I think that really depends on the company and the size of the company and the geographic, location and all that. But I also think it depends on the growth stage of the company. And something that's been really interesting to see in the cellular agriculture space that I didn't touch on earlier is that we're all now kind of moving from the space of pilot scale facility build out or pilot scale production to commercial scale production, which in many ways is a whole nother beast, because you're trying to say, how can we take a scientific bioprocess that we've locked in, do it at a pilot scale where we know we can repeat the process very consistently and meet specs, but then do that at commercial scale and frankly, learn how to become a food company and frankly, learn how to be a commodity. And so that actually entails building out some serious production capacity, which means, like I said, like steel and ground, building out first of their kind production facilities and figuring out that capital journey. And is venture, venture, I think, plays a very significant role in the growth of this industry and the expansion, including production, commercial scale production, but it also can't be the only way we build commercial scale production. It's not the best, fit for purpose for capital. And so figuring out what that next life cycle of the industry, I think, is a big part of the challenge, and that it's the unanswered question. And I think that there's a huge role for the government kind of systems to play here in that scaling journey, especially like we've seen in other novel technologies that we've seen a social good for, whether that's solar or electric vehicles or honestly just decarbonization, electrification broadly. I think we can see how the government influence has really helped shape those industries and maybe an area of capital that's not been explored enough.
Thanks, Shannon and Bryce. I'd love to hear from you a bit on the conventional industry side.
Yeah, just a few comments specifically about the technologies that I mentioned. On the hatchery technology, first and foremost, we have to prove to ourselves that it's economically viable to be able to put these crabs in a water at a very low cost per crab. There's certainly a cost of taking them out of the water, and this is not a put and take system. We're not putting them in the water to be able to harvest them later. We're putting them in the water so they can add back to the reproductive capacity of the fishery. So this is not put and take. This is put in there to give nature a helping hand. So finding economic relevance first is going to be difficult because crabs do migrate and they move around. And just because we have their DNA fingerprint or a microwire tag in their back fin doesn't mean that we'll be able to track them down as easily. With regards to the length-based spawning potential ratio, we measured about 165,000 crabs in our fishery last year, every month across 10 fishing areas. And we're finally getting an understanding of what's going on underwater. So to be able to scale that, it's just basically putting more people in more places and counting more crabs. So that comes with some labor costs, but not too much. And then once we get that in place and we're confident in the data sets and the statistical processes, at that point, we'll try to go garner support to take those types of measurements and use those to adapt our harvest control rules and strategies in the future.
Thanks, Bryce. As we hit the top of the hour, I'd love to switch it over and talk more about climate change. So how is climate change affecting your sector, and how is your technology poised to support our global efforts to mitigate or adapt to climate change? Shannon, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, great. I mean, I think just to kind of kick us off in a broad way, I think climate change is spurring entire conversations around what do our food systems in the future look like? And most importantly, how do we ensure food security, which I think has a big role to play with national security, and do so in a way where we're basically creating climate resilient food systems. So there's definitely a sustainability aspect there. There's also an adaptation and mitigation aspect to this. The reason I say that is because this interest, I think, is fueling a lot of the innovation and interest, especially funder interest in technologies like cellular agriculture. So I think they're part and parcel of each other. The growth of our industry is directly related to the demand for climate resilient food systems, and us starting that work today, so we're prepared for tomorrow. How is our innovation poised to address that? Like, obviously, what we've talked about earlier, we're seeing leveling out of wild capture stocks and catches. We're definitely seeing aquaculture fill a lot of that demand, but that demand you mentioned, Lauren, is exponentially growing, and we really have to figure out how we're going to have sources of supply to meet that. And so basically cellular agriculture is a key way to build that climate resilient food system in meeting that delta of animal protein demand. The other thing I just want to mention quickly, noting time, is that there's a promise to cellular agriculture that not only can we meet demand, but we can do so in a very resource efficient way, not only in terms of sort of water usage and land usage, but just in terms of like production efficiencies in a hyper controlled environment. So that's per se a little bit more on the land side, but especially in the production of animal protein, land use is a really huge, and coming from Western states, water usage is a really huge component. And so we're really poised to try and hit resource efficient animal protein production.
Thanks, Shannon. Bryce, how is climate change affecting your sector?
So I'm going to say I'm a little bit lucky here with my wild capture fishery with crabs, because they are very hardy little animals. they can survive and honestly even thrive in really varied water conditions, from the warm waters and sandy coral areas in Southeast Asia, all the way to the colder, muddy, brackish waters of the Chesapeake Bay here in Maryland. I certainly do expect migration over time. Will certainly be there as temperatures change. The one thing that really scares me is ocean acidification. And I think what we're seeing is we're nearing saturation points, which is really going to change how much of a heat sink the ocean will be able to be relied on in the future. And it's not going to be able to be counted on to absorb as much CO2 as it has in the past. So I think what you're going to see is air temps rising a little bit more quickly than they have in the past, which is really going to create even more of an imbalance. Like if you look at the North American migratory bird populations in the last generation, they've gone down anywhere from 25 to 40%, depending on who you look at and what types of data sets that you're looking at. But it's basically because the change in temperature of the water in the air are completely out of sync. So birds are migrating south and they're expecting to land at certain areas and eat certain fish, and those fish are either long gone or haven't showed up yet. So we're seeing large scale ecological collapse and not just our marine fisheries, but also with migratory birds that rely on that for a source of food. To me, honestly, to get to a zero carbon future, it's going to rely on totally new, efficient methods of energy generation. I think what you're seeing with fusion, that's probably 30 years off. There's a lot of companies that are doing offset systems for people that we've looked into. But the problem is once you get some critical mass on those offset systems, they're going to run out of offset capacity quite quickly. So I just look to the world of tech to help solve that, and we're going to do whatever part that we can do.
Thanks, Bryce. Dane, how is climate change affecting aquaculture?
That's a tough one to answer succinctly, just given how diverse and global the aquaculture sector is. But climate change is impacting the environment in which aquaculture is produced. That's doing everything from increasing temperatures and lowering dissolved oxygen levels to changing weather, and it's shifting where you can farm different species and what pathogens and concerns farmers have to worry about. I will say that there are things farmers can do to adapt. They can switch species, they can selectively breed the organisms they are culturing for expanded tolerance. All of these things cost money and increase production costs. But we have seen a lot of adaptation and resilience in the sector as a whole. Other thing I'd highlight is that aquaculture in many cases can actually play an active role in climate adaptation and carbon sequestration. Extractive species like seaweed and bivalves can directly sequester carbon in certain cases, and then provide ecosystem benefits to allow different ecosystems to adapt to changes associated with climate change. The other thing I would highlight is an increasing model of aquaculturalists being coastal stewards. So most aquaculture takes place in the coastal zone, whether it's in the water or on land. And as an example, historically, shrimp aquaculture has been the primary driver of mangrove deforestation globally. But at Conservation International, we're working on a new model where we help farmers get access to financing to intensify production on a portion of their historical ponds. So they produce more shrimp, make more money, but in a much smaller footprint, allowing them to restore mangroves on the remainder of the farm and reversing that history of deforestation, and also providing climate adaptation benefits to coastal communities in terms of sea level rise protection and storm surge protection. So the industry is adapting, and there's also these different models where aquaculture can actually help adapt and mitigate climate.
Thanks, Dane. And to round us out, Larson.
Yeah, thanks. And the way we view it is that climate and oceans and seafood are all interrelated, and to have a healthy ecosystem, the ocean needs to be resilient, it needs to be abundant, it needs to be balanced and healthy. This transition to the ocean being that will contribute to worldwide and global climate resilience, help us meet emission target reduction and secure food globally. We do believe that this needs to be low carbon efficient, circular, and global. It touches everything from not just from protein production, which we all know that seafood is really one of the lowest carbon proteins that we can imagine and produce out there today. But it's also shipping, it's renewable energy, it's biotech, and as Dane indicated there, actual climate solutions itself. As I referenced before, a lot of the groundwork that needs to be done is for the constituents that are playing here, and the shareholders, that their companies, their individuals, their governments. There needs to be collaboration, and there needs to be a groundwork and a framework established to really understand how we're responsibly managing ocean ecosystems and how we're actually collecting evidence and making evidence-based decision making. From the global macro trends, we're really seeing that today that the climate crisis is a dinner table conversation, and the general public is connecting the ocean with climate in general. So the increasing awareness that we're seeing is converging with broader consumer trends toward responsibly sourced products, and it's creating tailwinds that are accelerating investors' interest in the ocean for climate change. So the investments that we make today, we believe, will set the course for the emergence of the blue economy, both as a provider of protein and a climate solution. And the stakes have never been higher for the ocean. And today, entrepreneurs have shown that they have the knowledge, the technology, and resources to innovate boldly and deploy radical solutions. So we're pretty excited. It's not a good state today, but we see a bright future.
Great. Thank you, Larson. And thank you to all of our panelists today. We are quite short on time. This panel could go on for another half hour, just with all the great things that these panelists have to offer. But I'd love to turn it over to the audience to see if you have any questions for the panelists. You can either respond in the chat, or just, see if you could take yourself off mute, whatever is easiest. Oh, thanks. We have one coming in from Emily Bass. What policy levers can be used to accelerate these technological innovations to ensure American competitiveness? And Emily is from the Breakthrough Institute.
I won't speak for Dane, but I will speak for Dane that I think the Aqua Act is very important in this sector.
I would certainly say incentivizing fishery companies to invest in renewable energy generation.
Thanks, Bryce. That's great.
I would just mention making sure that we're setting up the enabling conditions for innovation. So that's partly regulatory approval and making sure that the agencies are working proactively towards regulatory pathways, which I think the FDA and the USDA have been doing a great job on, at least for cellular agriculture. And I think another big part of that is the financing mechanism. So whether that's utilizing the Farm Bill, for example, because while it's CHOW, it's also, big stages around the Farm Bill and saying, how do we create the food system that we want to see for the future, and what's the mechanisms to do so there. I think some examples are guaranteed loan programs, and weaving in some of the enabling conditions that we have for conventional agriculture and providing those to some of the innovative technologies as well.
And one thing I'd add to that, just briefly, on the aquaculture side, I think there's an opportunity while legislation and regulatory capacity is still developing for the U.S. to be a leader in wise use and sort of responsible management of the aquaculture sector. But one of the challenges, of course, is balancing the growth of the aquaculture sector so that farms can actually exploit economies of scale and remain competitive against international competition.
Thanks, Dane. Any other questions? We have 1 minute. All right, I'm not seeing anything from the audience at this point, but given we have just a few seconds left, I'd like to thank our panelists for coming to this session today, and thank you to the audience for joining us. If you've missed any of the panel, I believe that CHOW will be recording this and you can access it at a later date. So thank you so much for everyone for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.